Okay, I think we are ready to start. 8 o'clock. We can begin. Welcome to everybody. This is, I believe, our third discussion in the context of our study of Sefer Yonah, but it's really much more than about Yonah. I entitled it Yonah, Moshe, and Eliyahu versus God. Originally had the title of the Shir Yonah versus God, because that's what we started with, which was our question about Yonah and his running away and God chasing after him type of relationship. But in the end, we realized very quickly that this isn't just the story of Yonah. This is the story of all of the Nevi'im who struggle with the concept that God is forgiving not only to the righteous, but also to the wicked. That's really what the crux of the issue in the book of Yonah is. And as well, we saw it last week in the context of even Moshe Rabbeinu, who struggles to understand what is it about the midah of compassion and slow to anger, God who is Erech Hapayim, and how Erech Hapayim applies not only to the righteous, but even to the wicked. Erech Hapayim latzadikim, larishaim v'letzadikim. And that troubles Moshe, troubles many of the Nevi'im, because the end result is that there's a certain tolerance that is given to evil and to chait that enables it to flourish rather than holding it immediately accountable on a societal level. And God's hand there, midat rachamim, midat din. And so they struggle with it. We saw Moshe struggle with it in the context of after the sin of the golden calf, and there's the famous medrash about him going up to heaven and God saying to him, Erech Hapayim, slow to anger applies even to the wicked. Moshe says the wicked should perish. And I shared with you last week the medrash that talks about the notion of, or asks the question, Nefesh HaChatat, what should be the accountability to the sinner, to the person who sins? And there is a response of the Navi and the Nevi'im, the books of the Nevi'im, that talk about Nefesh HaChatat Tamut. It should be a soul that sins should be punished. There's an accountability before God that should be maintained. And the Nevi'im specifically demanded that on a certain level, or sought that on a certain level, because if you don't, then it allows the wicked, and we're not talking about somebody whose violations are minor. We're talking about people who are identified as nations who are wicked in the context of Nineveh. Nineveh was a nation that, or a city that became the capital of the Syrian Empire, and eventually exiled Israel with it. So that God should demonstrate compassion even for such people was a mystery to the Nevi'im, especially those who felt so clearly, so keenly identified with the notion of Torah, of righteousness, of goodness, that they developed a certain almost intolerance or low tolerance for the allowance of wickedness to thrive, because God is compassionate even to the wicked. And that's at the core of the question of how to balance the attributes of God, which are both din and rachamim. Even the story of Moshe in the cave, in the cleft of the rock at Har Sinai, is a story in which God shows him what we refer to as the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, the 13 attributes of mercy, but in that actual text. And we saw this last week, the Nevi'im, in the context of Moshe, God shows Moshe the elements of Rachamim, but he also shares with him that there are attributes of God that are din. The notion that that God visits the iniquity of the one generation over his second, third, and fourth generation, even if it's a matter of just holding the punishment in abeyance to see if they do tshuva, but if they don't do tshuva, then they're held accountable for all the generations. That's an attribute not only of rachamim, but also of din. The same holds true for the notion of emet, right? That's where our story began, with Yonah ben Amittai, Navi Emet, that Yonah demanded Emet, because on a certain level, from the perspective of the human being, truth means that if somebody does something that they're not supposed to do, they should be held accountable. And so the Nevi'im have this recurring theme. We saw it in Yirmiyahu, we saw it in Habakkuk, we saw it certainly in the case of Moshe, and tonight we're going to see it in the story of Eliyahu, that if you allow evil, chet, to thrive and flourish by being, or you enable it to thrive and flourish by showing compassion and tolerance even to the wicked. And therefore, that is the ongoing struggle that Yonah, Moshe, we saw last week, and tonight we're going to see with Eliyahu, seems to have with the concept of God's compassion or rachamim. How this all turns around in the end, like I said, you'll have to come back in 2 weeks for the final installment between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we will kind of bring this all to a close. But for today, our journey is going to take us to the story of Eliyahu. I showed you at the end of the shir last week that Eliyahu's story ends in exactly the same cave, in exactly the same cleft of the rock on Mount Sinai that Moshe's story of Rachamim took us to. And because this is a period where we say the Slichot and the Gimel Midot Rachamim, it's particularly appropriate. And this will also lead us back to, in a circle, back to Yonah at the end of, if not today, beginning of next week. So that's a quick review. If you, the recording is online. If you missed last week's shir or the week before, you're welcome to catch up quickly. Not tonight, not right now, but after the shir. And we are going to jump into share screen. We're all good? Everybody sees me? Everybody hears me? We're good? All right. In the chat, you should have the source page. I'm just going to copy it again for everybody. That's the source page. And I'm going to open up okay. If you can keep your cameras on, that is helpful to me. If not, I understand, but it is always helpful. We're going to start with the beginning of the story of Eliyahu. Eliyahu Navi appears in Tanakh for the very first time in the beginning of Malachim Aleph, Perek Yud Zayin. My goal for tonight is to look at 3 chapters of Sefer Malachim. That is an ambitious goal, but we're going to try to do our best. Story begins as follows. Vayomer Eliyahu hatishbi mitoshavei Gilad. Eliyahu Tishbi, meaning the Tishbite, identifying a name of an area from the inhabitants of the Gilad, says to Achav, king of Israel, Chai Hashem Elokei Yisrael asher amadati lefanav, by the living God, by the God of Israel who lives, meaning it's a language of an oath. Eliyahu stands up to Achav and he takes an oath. And he says in this oath, by God's name, God whom I stand before, im yeh hashanim ha'ele tal umatar ki im lefi dvari. If there be rain or dew in these years, except according to my word. Meaning, just to put in context, Eliyahu at this moment stands before Achav and says to him, there will not be rain in this land until I say so. Let me do that again. Eliyahu Hanavi stands before Achav, king of Israel, and says, I declare a drought. I declare no rain from here on forward until I, Eliyahu, say otherwise. Several immediate questions come to mind and have to be raised. The first and most obvious is why. More importantly, however, more significantly, who is Eliyahu? Who is he? Where does he come from? What is the context that leads him to this declaration of a drought? And on top of that, how is it possible for a Navi to declare a drought? If the Navi said there will not be rain in this land until God says so, Ki'im lefi devarav, I speak in the name of God, that I understand. But all Eliyahu says is, I take an oath by God's name that I will not let it rain until blank. He doesn't tell us what the blank is either, which is another problem. But this whole decree of a drought, of a lack of rain that will last, as we will see in a few moments, will last years, is Eliyahu's declaration, not God's. Eliyahu. Where is he? What is he? Who is he? Where does he come to Achav? So, to put some context to it, not completely, let's go back to the end of the previous chapter. Eliyahu is not mentioned anywhere in Tanakh until this verse. By the way, I know another Navi who we've been discussing at length that also starts a story without any background as to who he is, where he is, when he is, and where he's coming from, and that was Yonah. And the story of Yonah's mission also starts without any background. In Eliyahu's case, it's even more dramatic because this is Eliyahu's doing. If we go back one, actually, even before I go back, let me stay here for one moment and just take a quick glance at the Medrash in the Zohar, which is in the source page on source number 1. There are two number 1s, so I apologize for that. Medrash makes the Zohar makes the following statement. I'll read it in the Hebrew translation. This is the original Aramaic. Bo re'eh, tochazi, kafna, ra'av, famine, that is derived from, I'm just going to, there's a little bit of, and it's, okay. Sorry, I'm just going to fix, should have done this before. I apologize for that. Let's do. Okay, sorry about that line. Bo A, I'm not sure if it came from one of the participants by accident, so if I don't know who it is, but if they do, then if they can just erase it, that'll be great.
If you stop share and then reshare, it'll go away.
Stop sharing and reshare. Excellent, thank you. Okay. Bo A, hara'av eino ba la'aretz, eino ba'aretz, there cannot be famine in the land, unless compassion has been severed from judgment. Rachamim and din are almost at odds with each other in certain moments. And when you sever compassion from judgment, what you end up with is at the moment that judgment overwhelms compassion or rachamim or mercy, the result is batzoret or famine or drought. The Zohar's observation is exactly where Yonah begins. Yonah declares a drought in response to what exactly, we're not sure. But it certainly seems to be driven by this sense of judgment. He's talking to Achav. We all know who Achav is or what Achav was, right? Achav, idolatrous king who marries Izebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon, and introduces back into the land of Israel the idolatry of Baal into the land. It hasn't been a culture of idolatry of Baal in many generations till Achav. Baal is a fertility god, a god of rain, particular, Canaanite god of rain. And so Eliyahu's response to the introduction of the idolatry of Baal is to essentially seal the rain, seal the heavens. And that was his way of doing it. But if you go back a few psukim to the end of Perek Tet Zayin, and this it's not about Eliyahu, but it's about the background to Eliyahu's world. And we take a look at the beginning of the story of Achav. Achav ben Omri malach al Yisrael b'shnat 38 shana la'asa melech Yehuda. Achav comes to the throne, particular year. Vayimloch Achav ben Omri al Yisrael b'Shomron 22 shana, and he reigned in the Shomron in the north for 22 years. Vayas Achav ben Omri ara b'nei Hashem mikol ha'shilafanav. Achav, evil in the eyes of God. The definition of evil in the book of Kings is a function of idolatry. There are other qualities of Achav that were very positive. They're elaborated upon in the book of Chronicles. Vayhi hanakel lechto b'chatot Yeravam ben Nevat. Not enough to follow in the path of Yeravam ben Nevat. But vayikach ishat Izevel bat Etbal melech Tzidonim vayelech vayavod et Baal vayishtachu lo. He went and he married Etbal, the daughter of the king of Tzidon. Daughter of Etbal. You can see the cultural references to the idolatry of Baal and the names of these people. Izevel is Eshet Baal. Etbal is Ish Baal. Right? The names of their deities. Vayelech v'yavod et Baal vayishtach. Baal is a very complex idolatry. It's a fertility god, and fertility rites and worship were complicated. Vayakum mizbeach laBaal beit haBaal asher bana b'Shomron, and he builds an entire temple to the house of Baal. Vayas Achav et Asherah. Asherah is the consort of Baal, Ashtoret. Vayosef Achav lasot lahachis et Hashem Elokeinu mikom ha'chesu asher hayu lefanav. And he continued to anger God. For those of you who are with me in our study of Sefer Yehoshua, the next verse will be very familiar or important. In the book of Yoshua, when he enters into the land of Israel, the first city he comes to is the city of Yericho. And Yericho was in many ways the capital of the culture of Baal in the land of Canaan, primarily because Yericho is an oasis by underground springs. And so it's a green oasis in the middle of a desert. It became the center of culture of Baal. In the story of Achav, we find the following. At the time that Yoshua conquers Yericho, he puts a ban on rebuilding Yericho, and he puts a curse on anybody who builds Yericho. He poetically describes this curse as by his oldest son, he will set its gates, and by his youngest son, he will, firstborn, he will lay its foundation, and by the youngest, he will set its gates, meaning that his punishment will be within his own family. Be'amav banai chiel bet ha'eli et Yericho. Achav sets Chiel from Beit El the task of rebuilding Yericho, which makes sense. If you're rebuilding the culture of Baal, the center of it was the city of Yericho. However, the Navi tells us, "Ba'aviram b'choro yizda u'biskuv tziro hitziv dlatah." This Chiel Beit Ha'eli, because he was building Yericho in violation of the curse of Yoshua, paid the price within his own family of his own children. Kidvar Hashem asher diber biyad Yoshua ben, and exactly in accordance with the curse that Yoshua had set. This was the beginning of the recreation of the culture and idolatry of Baal. Next verse, Eliyahu HaTishbi mitoshvei HaGilad stands up in front of the entire nation and in front of Achav and says, there will not be rain in this land until I say so. Chazal, into that gap between chapter 16 and chapter 17, paint a very dramatic picture of what drives Eliyahu to make this declaration and to do so now. And that's the medrash that you have in the second source number 1, Gemara in Sanhedrin. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. I apologize. The translations are below. If you want to follow with the translation, I hope you can pull it up on your screen. I will read and translate as I go. So first, the story of Chiel, that he was burying his children in accordance with the curse of Yoshua. And Achav, who was very close with Chiel, it was Achav who set him the task of rebuilding Yericho. This Achav came to pay what we would call a shivah call. to Chiel from Beit El, and with him came Eliyahu, the Mishal Bishlama Beitamya, to go to visit the house of mourning. Yativ Kvikama. At that time, Chiel turned to Eliyahu and he asked him a question. He said, the curse of Yoshua, did it apply just to Yericho or to any city that was idolatrous like Yericho? Or if you renamed Yericho to a different name, would it apply equally? Eliyahu and Chiel are having this in-depth and intense conversation about the nature of Yoshua's curse, into which interjects Achav. Hashta Amar le Hashta livavata de Moshe lo kamakaima. Now you're telling me that Moshe's curse did not come to be. The Chtiv, as it says, if you will veer, if we say in Kriyat Shema, if you will veer in the path, from the path, and you will worship idols, then God will seal the heavens and seal the rain. Yehu Gavra, says Achav, this person, meaning myself, Achav says of himself, I've established an idolatry on every hilltop and in every block of the land of Israel, in every city. And there's so much rain, I can't even get to worship in these places that I've created because the rains are so abundant. Levata de Yoshua Talmidei Makaima? You're telling me that Moshe's curse, that if you worship idols, there'll be no rain, has not taken place. But Yoshua's curse, Yeshua is much smaller. Yeshua is a Talmud of Moshe. Yeshua is the next generation. You're telling me that Yoshua's curse is taking place? That was Eliyahu's taunt, says the Medrash. This is Achav's taunt. Immediately, Eliyahu stood up. Vayomer Eliyahu tishbi mitoshavei Gilad Chai Hashem Elokei Yisrael miyatal matar ki im lefi dvarim. Immediately Eliyahu said, that cannot be. If you, Achav, are going to use the fact that there's rain in the land as an act of God's compassion, if you are going to use that to say that you have to legitimate your idolatry, then I will put a stop to it, and I will stop the rain. Ki im lefi dvarim. He prayed for God, for God's mercy in the sense of agreeing to Eliyahu's decree. And God gave to Eliyahu the key to rain. Now, the language here is very specific. The Gemara later on will explain that there are three keys to operating the world that God maintains in his own pocket and is never given to a human being. They are the key to life, birth. They are the key to rain, sustaining life, and the key to Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. We'll see what happens with those three keys. In the meantime, Eliyahu says to God, I would like the key of rain. V'kam ba'azal, God gives it to him, and Eliyahu decrees a drought, and he leaves. Now, before I go back to the story of what happens next, interesting observation, whether or not the Gemara sides with or supports Eliyahu's decree or not. The Gemara then adds a line, Darash Rabbi Yossi b'tzipori, Abba Eliyahu kapdan hava. Eliyahu, in a term of endearment, he calls him Abba Eliyahu, Father Eliyahu, like Elisha, when he sees Eliyahu go up to heaven in a chariot of fire, he says to him, Avi, Avi, Rechav Yisrael Parashat, my father, Abba Eliyahu, Kapdanaya. He was hot-tempered. He lost his temper. And in that moment, he says to Achav, in a moment of rage, and he says, you think that because there's rain that legitimates your idolatry? I will stop the rain immediately. That's the introduction to the story, according to Chazal. And it makes sense from a pshat perspective when you read this introduction of Eliyahu's decree against the backdrop of Achav and his marriage to Izebel and the reintroduction of idolatry, specifically of Baal, and of the rebuilding of Yericho. Immediately after Eliyahu's decree, God now engages Eliyahu. Vayhi dvar Hashem elav lemor. Lech mizeh. Go from here. Ufanita lecha kedma. Go east. V'nistarta benachal Crete. And go and hide yourself by a certain brook called the Nachal Crete. Now, Nachal Crete is an interesting name because I'm not sure there's a map of where it is. I don't think it really matters where it is. It's more a concept of what it is. Right? It's a source of water because at the end of the day, there's no water left. Right? Why is there no water? Because Eliyahu has decreed a drought, no rain. So Eliyahu, in order to survive, God says to him, go and hide yourself. He has to hide because if he's discovered, Achav and Izebel will kill him. Hide by Nachal Crete. The word Crete is particularly interesting because Crete normally means to be cut off, destruction. So the Nachal is symbolic of that decree. Asher Pnei HaYarden, which is near the Yarden. Ve'aya me'anachal tishteh, and you'll drink from the brook of the Nachal. Ve'et ha'orvim tziviti lechalkel chasham, and I have commanded the ravens to bring you food there. In other words, Eliyahu has to go into hiding because of his own decree. So God says to him, okay, go hide by the Nachal, you'll have a source of water. And as for food, I'll get the ravens, who are normally a bird of prey, they will bring you food. Why is it that he has to go into hiding, and why he has to be sustained by the ravens and the river and this Nachal? Unclear. We'll see in Rashi in a moment. He goes to the Nachal, he's hiding. The ravens bring him bread and basar in the morning, bread and basar in the evening, and meat. And he drinks from the brook from the Nachal. However, after a year is done, the Nachal dries up. And the Nachal dried up because there was no rain. And if there's no rain, then the last sources of water are also going to dry up. Right? When there's no rain, the waters of the Kinneret drop, and the waters of the Yarden drop, and then the waters of the various brooks that run off the Yarden also drop, and there's no water to drink. Now, why is there no rain in the land? Well, there's no rain in the land because somebody decreed that there won't be rain until they say so. Who's the they? Eliyahu. Who decreed it? Eliyahu. So here is God telling Eliyahu to go and hide by a Nachal so he can drink water, and then the water of the Nachal dries up, and Eliyahu is forced out of hiding. Rashi says something fascinating here. And this is source number 3. Vayivash Nachal, the Nachal dried up. Why? Kidei sheyeda tzorech hagshamim. The Nachal didn't dry up by itself. The Nachal dried up because God wanted Eliyahu to understand the need for rain. And Eliyahu should understand that God was not happy with the fact that Israel is now, quote, literally dying of hunger. They're dying of hunger because there's a drought in the land. And there's a drought because Eliyahu decreed it so. Now, it's true, Eliyahu decreed it so that he could force Achav to give up his idolatry. But in the meantime, Achav is still worshiping idols. And the people who are suffering by this drought are the people of Israel. And that's the nature of judgment, is that it's a double-edged sword. Yes, you can use din to punish the wicked, but at the same time, sometimes that punishment hits and impacts people who aren't necessarily right. They're innocent. And this is the message that God is trying, says Rashi, God is trying to convey to Eliyahu. Eliyahu is still holding on to the key of rain. There will not be rain until Eliyahu says so. But for now, Eliyahu is still forcing this drought upon the people. So at the end of this year, God comes to Eliyahu, and he says to him, okay, that wasn't enough. Step 2, kum lech Tzarfata. Go to Tzarfat. Tzarfat is not France. Tzarfat is a city in the north, in the area near Sidon. V'yashavta sham, and go and dwell there. Hine tziviti sham isha almana lechalkalecha. And there, whereas by the Nachal he had a raven bringing him food, lechalkaloto, to sustain him, in Tzarfat he's now going to come face to face with the famine that he himself has decreed. And there in Tzarfat, there is a woman, a widow, and she will have to be the one to sustain. Who is this widow? What do we know about her? Not a lot. But the fact that Eliyahu is being sent to a widow for sustenance, for food, and we'll see she has nothing to eat, she has nothing for herself and nothing to provide for Eliyahu, and yet she's the one to whom God sends Eliyahu, further reflects this idea that Eliyahu is being forced to come face to face with the cruelty, and I use that term intentionally, with the cruelty of the very famine he has decreed against Achav. Because you can't decree a famine against one person. You can't stop the rain from one farm. It's about the rain in the whole land and the whole region. So then a lot of people are going to suffer. And that's the question that Eliyahu is being forced to address.
I don't understand how Chiel justifies building Yericho. What is he saying that he feels that he can rebuild Yericho?
It doesn't, in the text, it doesn't tell us what he said. He was commanded to do so by Achav. To Achav, Chiel, to all of them, it's a symbol of Baal and their reintroduction of Baal into the land. And that's the war now between Eliyahu and the whole operation of Achav and Izebel and Chiel and everybody else who's involved in the reintroduction of Baal. This is the war that Eliyahu is fighting against. Their support of Baal, which is a fertility god, a god of rain. So Eliyahu stops the rain. And that's the whole showdown on Mount Carmel, which is going to be the next chapter. We're going to get to that, where he struggles, he fights with the prophets of Baal for exactly that reason. So God says to Eliyahu, go to Tzarfat and go and find this widow, and she will support you. Vayakom melech Tzarfata. So he goes to Tzarfat. Just want to see where is this. Yeah, I share with you in this interesting comment of the Alshich. Moshe Alshich was a commentary in Makubal, a very interesting commentary on Chumash. Anach wrote the following, interpreted the story of the widow that Eliyahu was forced to go and meet in the following fashion. God who is compassionate, Eliyahu represents Din, is struggling with God. God in his compassion, Tziva lechat Tzarfat, commands Eliyahu to go to Tzarfat. Leman yir'eh b'makom mahu tzarat almana v'yatom, so that he should see the suffering that this widow and this orphan, because the widow has a child, this widow and orphan are going through because of his decree, because of his drought. And by extrapolation, go do the math. If this is one widow and one orphan, multiply that by all of the widows and orphans throughout the land who are dying in hunger because of you, Eliyahu's refusal to understand the role of compassion. And again, it comes back to this intense push to get Eliyahu to recognize the need for compassion, for rachamim amongst the people, even as he goes to war against Achav. And this is exactly the struggle. It's the struggle between the Navi and God. Just as the story of Yonah we saw was a struggle between Yonah and God. God chasing after Yonah, God chasing after Eliyahu, in a sense, trying to get Eliyahu to see face to face the consequences of this famine that he has decreed. So let's go back to the story. So Eliyahu goes to Tzarfat. And there, at the entrance to the city, he sees a widow who is gathering sticks, gathering firewood. And he calls out to her and says, "Can you please fetch me a little water so that I may drink?" Eliyahu was thirsty. So she goes to do exactly right, act of chesed. And so Eliyahu says to her, maybe I can have a bit of a morsel of bread that's in your hand. Vatomer, to which she says, Chai Hashem Elokecha, as your God lives, meaning same language of an oath that Eliyahu took to decree the drought. She has no idea who this man is, says to him by the living God, meaning takes an oath in God's name, Im yesh li ma'og, I have not a cake, I have not a morsel of bread, I have nothing. I would give you gladly, but I have nothing to give you. Ki im lo kaf kemach bakad, all I have is a handful of flour in a jar. Uma'at shemen batzapachat, and a little oil in a cruse of oil, little pach shemen. I'm here to gather 2 sticks. So I can make a fire, and then I can go and I can take this flour and I can take this oil. So that we can have a last meal before we die of hunger. That's what she says to him. So Eliyahu responds, Al tiri, don't be afraid. Do exactly what I tell you to do. First, prepare some piece of this bread for me, and then whatever is left will be for you and your son, meaning this was what we would call a test of faith. He continues and says, this is what God has said. The jar of flour and the cruse of oil shall not lack, they shall not end until God gives rain upon the land. Meaning that Eliyahu has now decreed a second miracle, that this oil and this bread, flour, should continue to suffice for them, sustain them, until such time as there is rain. The irony in this sentence is that he says, until such time as God brings rain. He hasn't identified himself. He hasn't told her that he is Eliyahu Hanavi. So he doesn't say until I give the rain, because the drought is caused by me. He refers to the rain as coming from God, which is the irony in the story. And she does exactly as Eliyahu commands. Vatochal, there's a Tivin Kri here. Vatochal hivahu uveta yamim. And so Eliyahu and this widow and her son were able to eat from this food, not just for one meal, but for many days. Indeed, the meal, the jar of flour did not run out, and the cruse of oil did not lack. Exactly as Eliyahu had spoken in the name of God. And so far, all is good. Eliyahu is sitting there in the house of this Almanah and her son, and there's a miracle, and the oil continues to last like Hanukkah. By the way, Hanukkah, open parentheses, Hanukkah is not the only oil miracle in Jewish history. There are, in fact, 2 in Tanakh. There's Eliyahu, and then there's a follow-up story of Elisha. That's a Hanukkah shir. At that point, the son got very sick. And his sickness was severe. Ad asher lo natra bo neshama. If the story is familiar to you, we read it as a Haftorah, but we also have the similar story by Elisha. Child dies, no breath left. Vatomer el Eliyahu. So she turns to Eliyahu in anger and says, Ma li valach isha Elokim. What have I to do with you, man of God? Isha Elokim is a Navi. What are you doing here? What are you doing to me? Bata elai le'azkir et avoni ve'la'amit et b'ni. You came here to bring judgment upon myself and about my house and about my child. Eliyahu was very moved, and he just takes upon himself an effort to rectify the situation. Vayomer Eliyahu, tani li et benech, give me your son. He takes her. He takes the child from her bosom. He takes him up to the upper chamber, and he lays down upon his bed, and he lays him down upon his bed. And he turns Eliyahu for the first time, turns to God and asks for compassion for Rachman. And he says, Hashem Elokai, Hagam al amana shani mitkorer ima hareot el hamit et bena. Are you, God, going to bring evil upon this woman, this widow, and take her son? And there too is the irony of this statement, because in many ways, it's not God who took this child, it was Eliyahu who took this child. And that in itself is a piece of the story. He stretched himself out of the child 3 times. 3 times he says, God, please, bring this child's soul back to life. So God listened to Eliyahu for the second time. First to give him the opportunity to decree the drought, and now for the second time it says God listened to Eliyahu, which is so ironic, right? Normally it's the Navi who listens to the man, we who listen to the voice of God. Here is God listening to the voice of the Navi. Vatashov nefesh hayeled al kirbo vayechi, restores the soul of this child, and he comes back to life. Vayikach Eliyahu et hayeled. Eliyahu takes the child. And he takes him hand in hand, and they walk down the stairs. He gives him to his mother. Your son lives. She says to Eliyahu, now I know. Ki ish Elokim ata. Now I know that you are a real man of God. Now they know that you're the real McCoy, that you are a real Navi. And that Udvar Hashem beficha emet. And the word of God in your mouth is true, is truth, is emet. And that too is the irony of the story, because the other Navi identified in a similar way, who demanded din, who demanded judgment, who demanded who fought against the midah of the attribute of compassion and rachamim as it applied to Nineveh was Yonah. And Yonah ben Amitai, Navi Emetaya, we talked about that in the first year. And here she says to Eliyahu, you are really Dvar Hashem beficha emet. How do I know? Because you have brought this child back to life. Now, how does it come to this, bringing this child back to life? Before I read the Gemara and the conclusion of the Gemara and Sanhedrin, I want to read the next verse. Vayhi yamim rabim. This is the next verse, beginning of the next chapter. Vayhi yamim rabim. Came to pass after many days. Udvar Hashem hayal Eliyahu. God comes to Eliyahu and says to him, Bashana hashlishit, the 3rd year. 3rd year since the drought began. This drought has been going on for 3 years. God comes to Eliyahu and says to him, Lech el Achav, go and appear before Achav. Remember, Achav has been seeking Eliyahu. Achav has been trying to kill Eliyahu. Know that I will bring rain upon the land. In other words, God says to Eliyahu, enough. We've played this out for 3 years. No more. Today it's going to rain. if it's going to rain today, Eliyahu, you're going to find yourself in a very difficult position. Because if it rains today and you don't say it's allowed to rain, you, Eliyahu, are going to find yourself having committed a terrible chilul Hashem. Because here you, in the name of God, have said, no rain until I say so. God says to Eliyahu, enough with the din, now it's time to bring a little compassion to the land of Israel. I'm going to bring rain upon the land. You, Eliyahu, go do whatever you need to do to make this work in your worldview. But if you do nothing, that will be a terrible chilul Hashem. You understand what's going on? Eliyahu is now being forced to play out the hand with Eliyahu, with Achav until the end, because God says by the end of today there will be rain. In the language of the Medrash that we started with, that's Gemara and Sanhedrin, the Gemara picks up from here and says, once God saw that there was suffering in the world, he told Eliyahu to go to this house of this widow in Tzarfat, and the child dies, and Eliyahu has to bring him back to life. In order to bring back the child's life, Eliyahu has to pray to God to give him the key of the resurrection of the dead. As I said to you at the beginning, the Medrash describes 3 keys that hold the laws of nature in play. Amalei, God says to Eliyahu, Shalosh maftechot lo nimsu l'shliach. There are 3 keys that have never been given over to an agent, to a shliach. Chaya geshamim v'tchiyat hametim. Life, rain, meaning birth, sustenance, rain, and resurrection of the dead. If I give you the second key, then they will say there's 2 in the hands of Eliyahu, the key of rain and the key of Tchiyat HaMetim. Doesn't work that way. Idea high v'shakal high. If you want the key of Tchiyat HaMetim, you give me back the key of rain. As it says, Lecher alacha bet namatar. In other words, if you want to, think about it from the perspective of Eliyahu. On the one hand, he's holding on to the key of rain because he's holding on to judgment, that the people who are worshiping the idol of Baal should know that this can't be tolerated. On the other hand, people are dying. So if he wants the key of Tchiyat HaMetim to stop people dying, he has to ask for compassion. He has to ask for rachamim. The human being is not capable of processing both midot on a global scale, both rachamim and din. One or the other. Give me back the key of rain, and I'll give you the key of rachamim, the key of Tchiyat HaMetim. And that's precisely what happens. Eliyahu is now forced into a showdown with Achav. The rest of this parak I'm going to skip because we read it as a Haftorah. It's famous. It's the story of Eliyahu and Har Carmel. We all know what happens. Eliyahu has a showdown with the prophets of Baal, again over rain on the top of Mount Carmel, which was a high mountain because the fertility gods were typically worshipped on the tops of mountains, because that's how. Right, you're closer to the rain, the closer to the clouds you are, the closer to God you are in that Ma'olji, in that worldview. He finally has this showdown. They are unable to bring fire out from the heavens. Only Eliyahu can bring fire out from the heavens. The whole context of this chapter is about, and Eliyahu makes fun of them, and he says, maybe your God is sleeping, maybe you should call out louder. Anyway, the story itself, at the end, the fire comes down, consumes the offering, and Eliyahu then goes and he kills all 400 of the prophets of Baal. And the assumption is at that point that Eliyahu has declared victory. The people have said, Hashem hu Elokim, God, Hashem is God. They've declared their loyalty. Eliyahu famously says to them, how long are you going to straddle the fence on both sides? Eliyahu seems to have won the day. And then, because they have declared the loyalty to God, Eliyahu, so to speak, enables the rain. And so it rains. Immediately in the next chapter, Parakitet, Vayaged Achav li'Izevel kol asher asa Eliyahu. Achav tells Izevel what happened, including the fact that Achav killed the 400 prophets of Baal. And Izevel sends a messenger to kill Eliyahu, to find him and have him executed. I will kill you the way you killed the prophets of Baal. Eliyahu is forced to run for his life. And in being forced to run for his life, essentially Eliyahu is being forced to recognize that he failed. Because if he fails to effect change in the king, in Achav and Izebel, and he's now going to run for his life, then essentially his whole effort over the last 3 years has failed. So he runs to the desert. And he goes and he sits under some tree. And he asked God to take his life. He asked to die. I know another Navi, by the way, who asked to die when he saw his life was a failure. Right? Yonah. I am no better than my fathers. I have failed. And he goes to sleep under this tree. And the malach comes to him and he says to him, get up, it's time to eat. A little breakfast will do you good, it'll get your strength back. I know another Navi who, at a moment when he asked to die, suddenly was forced to face the challenges of nature, heat, and the relief from heat and shade. Right? Yonah's experience in the context of the story of Eliyahu. So Eliyahu has a different test, but the same idea. The Malach comes to him and he says, eat. And behold, he looked up and there was cake, there was bread, and there was water. And he ate and he drank and he laid down again, and he was having a more comfortable moment. God, this Malach comes to him a second time and says to him, Kum echol, eat again, ki rav mimcha derech, because Eliyahu, you have a ways to go. So he got up again, he ate again, he drank again, and this time, that food, that second meal, gave him the strength to sustain him for 40 days and 40 nights, which is how our comparison to Moshe began. Ad Har Elokim Chorev, leading Eliyahu all the way down to Mount Chorev, to Har Sinai, where he comes into the very same cave that Moshe was in. Vayavosham el ha-me'ara vayalin sham. And there he goes to sleep. 40 days, 40 nights, no eating and drinking for 40 days and 40 nights. The comparison is very clear. There's also the 40 days and 40 of Ninveh. God comes to Eliyahu and says to him, Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Now, there's two messages in that question. First of all, it's an open question, right? Eliyahu, why are you here? Second of all, why have you run away? Right? Why have you run from your job in the Shema? But secondly, why are you here? Meaning, you've come to the cave in which God showed Moshe Rabbeinu the attributes of mercy. You, Eliyahu, you've been driven your entire life by seeking din, by seeking judgment, by seeking punishment against the wicked. What are you doing here? Malachapo, Eliyahu. You see the two questions. Eliyahu's response. Vayomer. I was zealous for you, God. Israel has abandoned your covenant. It means they destroyed your altars, they killed your prophets. And I'm the last one left. And now they seek my life. I've come to you, God. God says to him, go and stand at the entrance to this mountain. You can already, does everybody understand the language here, the parallel language to the story of Moshe and Har Sinai. Vayavor Hashem al panav vayikra, which we say at Slichos. Amadat bahar lifnei Hashem over. God is going to pass by you, and you'll see the back. You'll see the Abayirita tachorai panai lo yirau in the language of Moshe. And there will be a great and strong wind, tearing mountains, breaking rocks. But no, Eliyahu, lo beruach Hashem. God is not found in the rocks, in the wind. And then after the wind, there'll be a terrible earthquake. Lo beruach Hashem. God is not on the earthquake. And after the fire, after the earthquake, there will be fire. And you should know, lo be'esh Hashem. God is not on the fire. There'll be a still, small voice. Phrase that has become the centerpiece of Unatana Tokef on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And Eliyahu saw and heard this, he hid his face, like Moshe bowed down and hid his face. He went out to the entrance of the cave. A voice comes to Eliyahu and says to him, for the second time, Eliyahu, I ask you the question, what are you doing here? And before I read Eliyahu's answer, I want to show you what Chazal did with this story. And the easiest way to see it is in this statement of the Malbim, because it summarizes the whole story. The Malbim says of this conversation with the Kol Mamataka, the Ruach and the Rash and the Eish, the fire and the brimstone and the earthquake and the wind, and then the still small voice, says the Malbim, Umimenu lamdu shluchav u'neviyav. From this, his messengers and his prophets learned over the years that they shouldn't yell and make a big tempest. They shouldn't make an earthquake. They shouldn't bring fire and brimstone down upon the people. As Eliyahu did in his zealotry. God sends his messengers, his prophets, that they should approach the people with a still small voice. So they can draw the people closer with cords of love and with words that are soft words, compassionate words, rachamim words, not fire and brimstone. Eliyahu learned this important lesson. This is about how to convey to Achavi, Zevel, and all the people. Right? There's a point in time in which you need to recognize the value of rachamim and compassion and of hearing where the people are, and seeing the people and seeing this. If you bring din, if you bring judgment, if you bring drought because they're worshiping idols, okay, so it's erech apayim, it's compassion for the idolaters. But at the end of the day, they're idolaters. That's true. But if I bring drought, people will die. That's the contradiction. That's the dilemma. So God says to Eliyahu for the second time, Malach hapo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Nu Eliyahu, have you learned the lesson? Eliyahu's response, Pasuk Yudalid, Vayomer, Kano kineti l'Hashem Elokei tzvot kezvu b'tcha b'nei Yisrael t'mizbechotecha ras v'neviyecha v'gubachara v'yivaterani levadi v'yivakshu et nafshi lekachta. I'm not even going to translate it. I will just tell you verbatim, word for word. This pasuk is identical to pasuk Yud. Eliyahu's response is exactly what it was when he started. I was zealous for you, God. For Israel has abandoned their covenant. And God's response to Eliyahu, Vayomer Hashem Elav, Eliyahu, you have 3 tasks now ahead of you. Task number 1 is go deal with the nations of the world who's going to be king over Aram. Task number 2, go to Yehu ben Nimshi and who's going to be the next king of Israel. Okay. Task number 3, Ve'et Elisha ben Shafat me'avel muchola timshach l'navi tachtecha. Appoint your successor. Because you, Eliyahu, if you can't get the message, have failed, and therefore I'm firing you. Let me do that again. You, Eliyahu, are being fired. You will no longer serve as the Navi to the people. That task will fall to your successor. His name is Elisha. Go find him, go anoint him, go find your replacement. Says the Mechilta about that statement, Eliyahu, who was driven by zealotry on behalf of the people, Tavak Kvodav, he demanded honor for God, not, it was driven by a loyalty to God. And he says, I was zealous for you, God, etc., etc., etc. But God's response, go and appoint Elisha your successor. She'ein Talmud lomar tachtecha. Why does the text say to replace you? She'i efshar b'nevuatach. Because God says to Eliyahu, I can't. This is a moment I need a Navi who understands the people and who understands compassion for the people, even if it means a tolerance for the very idolatry that you set yourself at war against. And Elisha will be a completely different Navi than was Eliyahu. The exact opposite of everything Eliyahu was. And that's the story. That's the story of Eliyahu. Eliyahu ends up starting with, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Eliyahu starts off with a decree of din, of judgment, drought, lack of rain, specifically because he's fighting against the idolatry of Achav and Izebel and all that it represents, and to sustain, to fulfill God's words in the Torah that if you worship idols, there'll be no rain. Well, God is allowing the rain because God is compassionate, says Eliyahu. But that's misplaced. Look at how much idolatry is allowed in the world. And instead of not allowing Eliyahu's decree, God enables it, but he also then embarks on a 3-chapter-long conflict with Eliyahu to force Eliyahu to look at the consequences of being overly judgmental and overly zealous, and what happens when you live a life of kana'ut. What happened to Pinchas, who ultimately was self-destructed in Sefer Shoftim. We'll get to that story as well. God says, no, you need to appoint a successor. If you can't follow, I draw you all the way to the cave where Moshe saw the Midot HaRachamim. If you can't understand what a Kol D'Mamadaka is needed, then appoint your successor. Your task is finished. Much like another Navi we all know and story we are familiar with, which was Yonah, who even after he was sent to Nineveh, and even after in Nineveh he says exactly what God tells him to say, and yet, and God is compassionate, they do tshuva, and God is compassionate, and he forgives them, and Yonah knows that it's a fake, and Yonah says, I'd rather die than live with this inconsistency. Gemara says, and we talked about this in the first class, that when God sent Yonah on this mission, that God sent him on this mission to finish it, but then not to continue. Yonah too essentially was fired from his position because he was driven by this desire, this intense commitment to din and to emet, rather than to understanding the role of rachamim. So we end up with this very interesting, compelling, and in some ways tragic parallel that leads us from Yonah to Moshe, back to Moshe, and then from Yonah to Moshe and back to Eliyahu. All three at that moment, Moshe is the only one who is able to process the balance between din and rachamim, but Yonah and Eliyahu are driven by this emet, Yonah ben Amittai, or the language of the Shat Sophatita says to Eliyahu, Udvar Hashem beficha emet, you are a man of emet. That's true, a man of din, intensity around that characteristic of emet. The end result is that the stories of Eliyahu and the stories of Yonah are essentially the stories of a Navi driven by the understanding of the role of judgment and punishment for the wicked, and having a very hard time with the concept of rachamim and compassion, because they live in a very black and white world. They live in a world where it's either din or it's rachamim, but you can't have both. And that's the world of the human being. That's not the world of God. Like God is trying to teach them that you need to be able to balance them both. That's very hard. So that's the story of Yonah. That's the story of Eliyahu. They're almost identical. There's 2 points that we need to pick up on for the beginning of our next class, which is in 2 weeks' time. Tuesday night between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. And that is, why do we read the story of Yonah? And it's alluded to parallel of Eliyahu on Yom Kippur of all times. It's not only the story of a people who have sinned and who have done tshuva, but it's also the story of a Navi who has essentially sinned, and God chases him to teach him a lesson. Right? The story is an odd story for Yom Kippur. So why are we reading this story as the Haftorah of Yom Kippur afternoon? That's one part of the question we started with. We haven't answered. The other part of the story is, how do we resolve the question? Yonah ends with a question. How do you forgive a people like Nineveh? And God answers him. What does God answer him? God answers him without an answer. You had compassion over a vine. I shouldn't have compassion over the people of Nineveh. So what we need to understand is, what is God's answer to Yonah? What is God's answer to Eliyahu? What is God's answer to Moshe? What essentially is the core message that we're supposed to take away? Because we're certainly not supposed to take away the message that we side with the Navi, right? In this case. So the struggle, the conflict between the Navi and God is so unique, so dramatic, we have to take a step back and we have to ask ourselves, what is the message that we are trying to learn from these stories, and how does it relate to Yom Kippur? That's the task remaining for us in the last shir, and hopefully we will get the B'ezrat Hashem in 2 weeks' time.
תודה רבה ושנה טובה.
The same to you. I know I've gone over my time a little bit. I apologize for that. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to stay on and try to.
This is wonderful. I wonder whether the ambivalence towards Eliyahu, judgmental, but being punished for being judgmental, echoes the ambivalence of Lo Yadun Nafshi Adam before the flood. Is there an ambivalence of Hashem to destroying all the world in the Mabul? And is
yes, so it comes back to the question of the comparison to Noah. It's not God's ambivalence here. It's Yonah's, it's Eliyahu's ambivalence, or it's Eliyahu, sort of the conflict between them. Maybe, I'm not sure. I don't think it's about an ambivalence. I think there's a lesson being driven. Eliyahu is all about kanaut and about zealotry and about din and about absoluteness and about a world that's black and white. And what God is trying to convey is the message that the world, from God's perspective, is not black and white. There's a lot of gray, and that God has to uniquely balance din and rachamim together. That's not something the human being is so easily and can easily process. It's something which people have a hard time with, on one end or the other. Some people have a hard time with din, and some people have a hard time with rachamim. Right? That's exactly the issue.
Rabbi,
Yes.
It seemed a little maybe ironic to me that, and we've talked about the significance of names, Yonah ben Amittai, that Elisha should be Ben Shaphat, which is judgment.
That is
I
interesting.
would have thought he could be Ben Chesed or Ben Racham or something like that. And then his name is Shaphat.
Yeah, okay, I hear that.
Sense of humor in the
That's the humor.
That's the humor in it. Yeah, for sure. Elisha is exactly everything that Eliyahu is not. There's no question.
right. Elisha he has to kiss his parents before he leaves.
Right. Everything Elisha does is a opposite reaction to Eliyahu, for sure. Including the bringing back to life of the child who dies. Right?
Yes.
That's Misha Shunamit. Okay.
Thank you.
You very
Fantastic.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. It's nice to see everybody, familiar faces.
Shalom Tova, Gemar Tov. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Marvelous insights. Thank you.